welcome back. Now that we have some data, we're going to talk about getting to understand your data. And taking the time to understand your data is probably the most important step in any data journalism project. It's very easy to make assumptions about data or to forget to check certain things, but you need to treat data with as much care as you would treat any source in any journalism project. Data has the reputation for being objective, but more and more we're seeing that data is in fact not objective. The way you collect the data, how you collect the data, and who you collect the data from makes a lot of difference in what that data is going to tell you. So in this section, we're going to talk about building a data biography. So that's getting to know the details and the historical specifics of your data. I'll tell you up front, it can be a little bit time consuming, but it's well worth your effort because really understanding your data is what can make an average or pretty good data journalism piece into an outstandingly good data journalism piece. And it will give you all the confidence in the world to know that you understand your data. So we'll be writing something called a data biography. And what that means is we'll interview the data about who, what, when, why, and where the data was gathered. In your course notes, there is a template to the kind of data biography that I use. Feel free to use that one, or feel free to adapt it to meet your own needs. Each person has unique needs. So first thing, we now have our data, and open up whatever tool you want to use to record your data biography, whether it's the tool that we provided or an adaptation of your own, and we'll walk you through it. For this example, we're going to use data about violence against women. This is an area where I've done quite a lot of work, some data journalism work and some research work and some nonprofit monitoring and evaluation work. And I can tell you that the data in this area is very complicated, much more complicated than it might appear at first. And yet we really want to be able to use data in this field because it's important to have evidence, especially in an area where there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of optics. There's a lot of different opinions. It's really nice to have some quantitative evidence that you can use to include in your journalism materials. So we're going to look at data from the United Nations, which is a reputable source. And they put out a 2015 report on the state of the world in terms of women. And an entire chapter of that is dedicated to violence against women. It's very evidence-based. It's very data-heavy. So let's say we're going to use this data as a source in our data journalism project, and let's figure out how to get a data biography written for this data so that we really understand the data we're working with before we start digging into the data itself. So finding the details about the data is not always as easy as I think it should be, but it's almost always possible. So here in the report, we can see they refer us to the statistical appendix. You always want to look for the statistical appendix. That's where the nitty-gritty is going to be. And they say it's at this site. However, this site is not obviously a statistical appendix. That's a very nice data viz. Looks like maybe made with Tableau. And if we look over here in the chapters, we can download the data, which is very helpful. We'll do that. But we can't download the statistical appendix. We have to go all the way over and kind of poke around until we find the statistical appendix here. So we want to download the narrative, the data, and the statistical appendix. So we'll look at the data first, just really briefly, to make sure it's what we think it is. And yeah, so this data is showing us the rates of violence against women in different countries over different years. And there's a few footnotes for places where the data might be a little weird or we might need to dig in a little bit more. So that's great. We want to note that right off the bat, that they're already saying that there's places that this data, it might not be what you expect. And if we look quickly, just skim the data for how useful it's going to be and anomalies that we might see. Right off the bat, here's something that catches my eye. For the country of Malawi, in 2004, and 2005, there's a big difference in those rates of violence. And then that rate goes back to the original rate a few years later. So that makes me wonder, did that trend of change in violence really happen in those years in Malawi? Or is that something about how the data was collected? So this is why you need to spend time on a data biography, understanding the details of the data that you're working with. So let's see if we can get to the annex, and we'll open up the annex, which is much better. So looking at our spreadsheet, we'll want to know the dataset name, United Nations, Women in the World 2015 Violence Against Women data, and always include an original link to where you first found the data. I can't tell you how many times we've messed up the data in one way or another, and we need to go back and get an original copy. I know you seem like you'll be more organized and you will never have to do that. But just in case you ever have to do that, you really need to retain the original link. Also a link to where you're going to be storing the data. And then our first real question, who collected this data? So let's look at table 6.1, which came out of this data. And this shows the number of countries that were collecting this data over different time periods. And now that's a very important thing to notice. Because if you want to take this data and say country Z has the highest rate of violence against women in the world, you can't really say that based on this data. You have to say country X has the highest rate of violence among the countries that collected data. And some countries will not be collecting data because they have a high rate of violence against women, and some will not be collecting data because they have a low rate. And many other reasons, financial, governmental, there are a variety of reasons. But it's really important that you take a look at who collected the data and find out exactly which countries did and did not collect the data. Second thing is we'll want to see how they collected the data. Quick word about sample size. Sometimes a large sample size means that the data is very well collected. But not necessarily. Let's take an example. If in our community we want to understand how our community feels about Walmart, do they like Walmart or do they not like Walmart? And if we randomly select 35 people in our community and we ask them, we'll get a pretty good representative sample of yes or no. So the results of that survey with 35 randomly selected people will be a pretty representative idea of how the community feels about Walmart. However, if you go inside a Walmart store and survey people as they're walking in, which is very convenient, people are very accessible, they'll probably talk to you, and you survey 5,000 people inside that Walmart, that sample size is much, much bigger than the 35 sample size for our first study. But the results are completely non-representative because the way the people were sampled is not representative of the community. The people inside the Walmart are much, much more likely to like Walmart. It's a very simple example, but it raises an important point that the size of the sample is not the most important number to tell you if this is an accurate or representative data set or not. How they collected data. So this is what we want to look for in building our biography. So let's go to our Malawi example in greater detail. So we're looking at the statistical appendix here for the 2004 and 2005 data collection. And we can see who collected the data. In 2004 is USAID. And who collected the data in 2005 looks like a private researcher. So that makes a really big difference. So 2004 was the Demographic Health Survey. We look at that website, and that is funded by the United States Congress. That's a USAID survey that's conducted widely. We can see from this website that it's a large sample, and then it's a representative sample. So this data probably does represent what's happening on the ground reasonably well, and it's usually really traditional methodology. This survey's been conducted for a long time, over many years. This other data is being collected by a private researcher, and it looks like they're using what they're calling an innovative methodology. So that's really important to note. It's very possible that these two numbers in 2004 and 2005 are so different because the way the data was collected was different. Who collected the data is very different from the 2004 data to the 2005 data. So, who was included in the data collection is also really important. Who they collected the data from. So we'll look here and we'll see there's many different age groups, and sometimes married women are included, sometimes all women are included, sometimes currently married women are included. This is a really important question for any data set. A surprisingly large number of data sets that seem large and inclusive actually exclude sometimes key populations, sometimes people living in institutions, sometimes people living in incarceration, sometimes people living on reserves, sometimes people who don't have permission slips that get signed. It's really important to find out who was allowed in to answer the survey or contribute their data and who was not. Then when did they collect the data? So we know for this example, 2004 and 2005. But it's really important to take a moment and think about this. If we look at this table of rates of violence for each most recent year available, there's a big difference between data that was collected in 2003 and data that was collected in 2011. Violence against women is a social and cultural trend, and so the time that the data is collected will have an impact on the number. We'd like to think that the later the data is collected, the lower the number is, but that's not always true. Sometimes there's wars or conflicts or different other social trends that will be having an effect. So is it really okay to compare data from 2003 to 2012? That's a decision you need to make, but you need to know that you're making the decision by filling out this part of your data biography. When was the data collected? That's especially true of things like financial data. Was it collected before or after or during 2008? Or political data, was it collected in an election year, just after an election? There's a lot of reasons to pay attention to when the data was collected. Finally, we want to look at why did they collect the data? The reason that data is collected often influences how the question is asked, how likely the person is to tell the truth. For example, income data that is collected by a national revenue agency is usually quite different than income data that is collected in an anonymous social survey. So you want to know why the data was collected. In our example here with Malawi, this first data was collected as part of a global international effort to track trends over many decades. And the 2005 data was collected to demonstrate the new research methodology. So neither of those why the data is collected is better or worse. It's just really important for you as a journalist, someone who's going to present this data to the public, to your readers, that you understand what you're presenting. So this is a quick example of how to fill out a data biography. I would recommend doing it for every single data source that you come in contact with and plan to use, just like you would with any source in a journalism project, because that way when you get down to the nitty-gritty of the editing and the finalizing, you'll have full confidence and a really good reference that you can rely on to build your foundation. That's the data biography. Thanks.